Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Distinguished Speaker Series of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. On behalf of our partner here at Bradley University, I would like to welcome our friends from the Tennessee World Affairs Council and the other councils from across the World Affairs Council system. Tonight, we are delighted to have Ryan Heath as our guest speaker. He is author of Global Translations for POLITICO. It is Politico's global newsletter and podcast, and he previously authored Politico's UN Playbook, Brussels Playbook, and Davos Playbook. Ryan moderated the first presidential debate of the 2019 EU election as part of a 5-year stint in Politico's European leadership team. He appears on CNN, NBC, and BBC, and is the author of 2 books on politics. Prior to his role at Politico, Ryan wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, where he is right now, and worked for the European Commission in Brussels as a presidential speechwriter and later as the Commission's spokesperson for digital issues. Tonight, Don Sanford will be leading the discussion. He is a member of the board of directors of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council and a retired social studies teacher and a man about town. He knows all about the world. So take us away, Ryan. I think you're going to make a few comments first, and then Don's going to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, and hello to everybody. It is true, I'm down under. It's 10 a.m. on Friday here, and I thought I will go through some remarks, but I'll do it quite quickly because I just think the question and answer will be more interesting, and I know you'll have a lot of questions. And when I went to make my notes for today, I thought, hang on, I'll check what I said to World Affairs Council back in 2019, last time I spoke to a group in Washington. And I raised 3 issues there, according to my notes, about the changing US role in global power structures. And I was looking at China, sustainability, and the hollowing out of institutions in democracies. And I think that, you know, there is a pretty big blind spot in that list, but I think all 3 of those things remain critical issues and have been the things that the Biden administration has been using as its foundation for how it moves forward for the whole term, now that we've gotten to the 100 days. And I think the one that clearly is missing, and I think I was fairly shamefully ignorant myself, was the issues of racial divisions in the US and how that affects America's ability to project itself in the world and how it's seen by others in the world as well. And I think we saw over the last year that was true. And I think we're even seeing in this first 100 days, oh, sorry, that is my mother's phone. We're gonna turn that off. I'm in Sydney, Australia, looking after my mom. She is recovering from a double lung transplant. So hopefully that won't go off again. I think that Biden has, we've seen in the last week, even in Minnesota, the difficulty that Biden is going to keep having if he isn't finding more structural solutions and more ways to bring the country together on those racial issues. But I think that, you know, I would say that if you combine all 4 of those issues, that you're getting a pretty good picture of what Biden is using as the foundations for his policy agenda. And I think I would assess that he's relatively joined up and his team is relatively joined up in 2 relevant senses there. The first is that I think they are doing a fairly good job at listening to various voices and people that they could be including in the conversation. And I think that's slightly separate from whether congressional Republicans are willing to jump on board. So I'm essentially not faulting Biden for not being able to unstick that problem in Congress. I think that there is a significant level of responsibility still on Republicans there. And then the second relevant area of joining up is that I think he's made it quite clear that foreign policy has to be understandable to middle-class America and has to serve the interests of that middle class if it's going to fully succeed out in the world. And so I think we've heard various formulations of how that gets sold and presented, but I think that it's a smart move on his part. And it does mean that some things are happening slowly because America is prioritizing itself in the vaccine rollout, for example. But I think it's the only sensible political move, even if it does come with a price tag attached to making that choice. On that question of bipartisanship, I think that the Biden team actually has pretty good links in Congress with Republicans who work on foreign policy. They're in relatively substantial agreement when it comes to China and China-related issues. If anything, I would think that they perhaps agree too much when it comes to issues like the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that's about to connect Russia and Germany. It's almost complete. Neither party is happy about that. They're going to make moves to try and stop it. But I think the problem there is not, can the two parties agree? It's the fact that all of this is happening 3 years too late. They might have had a chance to stop it 3 years ago. I really don't think they've got close to zero chance of stopping it at this point. And the reason I use that example is that, you know, we hear a lot about the partisan gridlock, but in foreign policy, it's not as true. Like, there is still a relative degree of cohesion from what I witness anyway. When we start to look at some of the other things that Biden has to be preoccupied with before he can move to some of those bigger global challenges, I'm thinking things like the $2 trillion infrastructure plan. I'm not very hopeful for compromise on that front. It's not to say that Republicans won't get some of what they want, but their starting position is so far away from what the administration wants. It really reduces the administration's incentive to work out a real compromise. So I think, like, Biden will essentially try and push through the 95% version of his plan. And I don't think he has a 95% chance of getting it, but I think that that's what he'll push. And, you know, he's more likely than not to get most of what he wants. In terms of the areas he's likely to struggle in, I don't really know whether you can define them as purely domestic or as having some foreign policy link, but I would say that immigration and gun control are the two issues he's going to have the most difficulties with. And I've worked in the past on migration policy in Australia, and I've certainly learned the hard way from Australia's policies towards refugees and unauthorized arrivals that you really struggle to stop the flow, and you can't really manage the border effectively without very expensive deterrence campaigns and without very expensive enforcement campaigns. And that ranges from very big advertising campaigns in the sorts of countries where these arrivals are coming from at the southern border, and making clear that they're not going to be allowed in, and what the penalties and the potential downsides for you as an individual if you put yourself in the hands of people traffickers. You know, the Australian government has invested billions in those campaigns in the countries that were sending people by boat to Australia. And that was a much smaller situation, much smaller numbers than what America is dealing with. So for the US to cope with that, it's going to have to invest a lot. You have to do enforcement against people smugglers, who are the greater evil in the situation, I would say. And I think it's just a case where whether it is not managing the border or there being human rights failures around the management of the border, I just see that the administration is going to be copping criticism from both sides throughout its entire term. I don't see that there's any way around it. There's too many people, the issues are too entrenched, and they're just going to have difficulties and potentially end up pleasing nobody in what they try to do. I now am getting to the point of rambling. Maybe a thought on the coronavirus pandemic. That is something that is, I think everyone understands at the surface level that America doesn't look very good at the moment, and that it has one of the worst outbreaks and uncontrolled COVID situations in the world. And yes, it is improving, that's also clear. But where I'm sitting in Australia, people look at me like I have walked into the room with the plague if I tell them that I've just arrived from the US. And I'm not kidding. We were turned away from one restaurant last night because I filled out that I'd been in another country in the last 28 days. And that itself, I think, is an illegal action, but I wasn't going to ruin everyone's night by fighting them about it. And they're still horrified here that we're getting 900 to 1,000 deaths a day in the US. And to put it in context, there's been 910 deaths in the duration of the entire pandemic in the entire country of Australia. Now, population 25 million, it is not the same as the US, but they clearly have had it more under control. They have the benefit of being an island, but they're not really interested in the fact that I am fully vaccinated, that I had 6 negative tests in the last 3 weeks. They still treat me with suspicion because of the association with the US. And that doesn't in any way mean Australia is not America's ally, but I make the point because it's a very severe impact on America's reputation. It's no longer a bad policy choice in the way that people might disagree with, the Iraq war or something like that. It's very much seen as an indication of a system failure, and that there is something deeply wrong in the systems that people perhaps place too much faith in America. People idolize America in Australia, and they look up to it and think it's the bigger place or the center of all action, and that Americans know how to do things and solve problems. And COVID really demonstrates that that is not true, at least in all cases. And I think America is turning that around and demonstrating it's got capacity in the vaccines that other countries simply don't have. But I think very much America is going to have to shift footing when we get to about May or June, I would say. Once it's clear that anyone who wants the vaccine can get it, and we're not playing these games where we're all staying up till midnight, like searching for a single appointment, etc. Once it becomes reasonably easy to get the vaccine for everybody, then I think America has to start figuring out what it can do with those extra doses that it has contracts for, and how can it get them to other parts of the world to repair that damage from last year. And I'm very critical of people who say that the US or other rich countries are hoarding vaccines. I do not think that's true. I think the vaccines are going where the biggest outbreaks are at the moment. I think that we have over-purchased. We've purchased more vaccines than we need, but they don't actually exist yet. There's no doses to hoard in most instances. There is one case of a factory in Ohio that is full of AstraZeneca vaccines. Given that Fauci has said we don't really need them in the US, given that it's not approved for use in the US, I think it's silly that those vaccines are sitting in an Ohio factory. They should be moved somewhere else. But by and large, we're not at the stage yet where there's hoarding. But I think if you talk to me in June, there might be some hoarding going on if there isn't a plan for getting them out there. So maybe I will wrap it up there. I have lots of other thoughts, but I'm sure you have just as many questions. So I will be very happy to answer all of them.
Well, that's a great lead in, Ryan. And I will tell you there very quickly, though, that I'm tomorrow 3 weeks from my second vaccine. So I'm going out to party tonight once this is over. And for all you young people, ha, ha, ha. That you make a very good point about that. Before I start with a question, though, I would like to make sure the audience knows that Global Transitions newsletter that you have, if you don't subscribe to that and get that in your email on I believe it's a weekly basis.
It's now 3 times a week.
Or I was gonna say, I know
we're so enthusiastic, we increased it.
I gotta say, I know it's showing up more than that now. It is outstanding. That's how I keep up on an awful lot of the world events. And Ryan is connected. Having been in Europe, I think that foreign perspective, and he's got contacts. So I cannot say highly enough. If you want to be up to date and knowledgeable on foreign affairs, that's a great place to start. So just Google Global Transitions and
translations.
So yeah, so there's my plug. And when I get to DC, you can take care of me. The events have been just rapidly swirling, especially this week on foreign policy and foreign affairs. And so very quickly, I want to get right into, and I'm changing my format to some specifics. And let's go ahead and start with Afghanistan and what your take is about his announcement and the policy there.
Yeah. At some level, I consider it inevitable, because I think that the administration has decided it's not going to run away from any of the big issues. If you look just sort of structurally, sort of big, you zoom out and you look at the 30,000-foot picture of what this administration is doing, he's diving into very big issues and putting very big price tags on what he's willing to invest in solving those issues in a way that I never would have imagined, looking at the history of Biden across his 5 decades, or how he initially presented himself as a candidate. And I don't see it in terms of he's doing that in bad faith or he tricked us all. I don't mean it in that sense. I think he just feels that he has been confronted with a very different country to what he was expecting or hoping to lead, all the other times he ran for president. And he's just changing the scale of what he's trying to solve. And you can't really have that approach and then just sort of not try and deal with the Afghanistan issue, let's say. And we're coming up to 20 years now. I try not to just adopt slogans that other people use, but forever war is a pretty good description of what's going on there. And I think it's always been lacking what the victory is supposed to look like. You know, people have wanted victory, but have never really been able to define it or describe exactly what it's going to look like. And I think that the challenges the world faces are different to what they were 20 years ago. It doesn't mean that there is not a risk of terrorism fueled by extremists in that region, but you don't necessarily have to define yourself as being in a war. You don't always have to put your own people on the front line. You know, we have completely different capabilities when it comes to things like drones now that did not exist in 2001. So for me, I'm not surprised by that decision. I think a lot of other countries, they have very minor commitments to Afghanistan now, but it's not really big news in Australia, actually, because Australia has drawn down its troops. A lot of countries have taken this decision already, essentially, and America and perhaps the UK are the only big players left there at the moment. And then, of course, the risk, and I'm not an expert when it comes to the Afghanistan conflict, but we've seen in other areas where the US has not wanted to be as involved in the Middle East, doesn't stop Russia coming in and being difficult and meddling. So, you know, and we know their history in Afghanistan. So I certainly hope people are keeping hawk eyes on what could go wrong as a result of following this policy. But it strikes me as something that was always going to happen at some point in this first year of his administration, and probably the right thing to do. It would be my assessment. But, you know, it's easier said than done. I think we've learned that the hard way over the last 20 years as well.
One quick follow-up on Afghanistan before we move on is I just finished reading Jessica Donati's book Eagle Down with the U.S. Special Forces there, and it was pretty obvious that without sufficient close-in air cover, not just bombers flying from like Qatar, from Al Udeid and so on, isn't going to cut it. If you don't have the close-in air support, even the special forces were in danger because they weren't getting enough. I'm not sure how I see that the Afghans are going to be able to hold out against the Taliban. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think that is a fair risk as well. It's tricky. I just feel like money has been piled into the country for 20 years and it also hasn't gotten rid of the Taliban. So that doesn't mean we should just leave all the women of Afghanistan to their fate. I'm not arguing that America should cease to exist in Afghanistan. But I just think that the country, as in America, isn't willing to make that sort of commitment. So being stuck in the holding pattern where you don't really solve the problem, but you keep putting people in harm's way, it doesn't solve it either. So I think essentially they're saying there are other priorities now and we have to focus on the other priorities. And I don't think it's ever pleasant to, you know, have to go into the granular details of what that means, because these are real people's lives that will be affected, but everything is a choice at the end of the day. And by not choosing to deal with other problems, you're also negatively affecting other people's lives. So we have to think of those counterfactuals as well, not just the problems that might be caused by the US leaving in Afghanistan, because it's got to be a global picture that you think about when you make those allocations.
And we'll leave that with what one of the Taliban leaders said: "You have all the watches, we have all the time." So it may not matter. Well, okay, Russia. We've got the buildup in Ukraine. You've got the sanctions that came down today for their cyber attack. We're seeing in the Arctic some contention going on. You mentioned, they're meddling kind of everywhere there in the Middle East. Where are we with Biden and his policy, you think, towards Russia and Putin?
Yeah, it's very tricky, and I see some questions popping up in the chat as well there. It was never a good look the way his son was involved in Ukraine. I don't think you can compare apples and oranges, but I think that it's kind of a radioactive issue for the Biden people, and it's in a sense their own fault. So they need to have at least self-awareness, even if they don't need me piling onto them about that. I think that Putin's goal is simply to destabilize all the time, and it's become a lot cheaper to destabilize. So I think this is one of those issues where you really do need bipartisan support. And I think that, I'm not sure that they're as close on Russia as they are on China in Congress, but at least there is a shared level of concern about the threat. I don't think there's a shared sense of what to do about it, and I think that each side still thinks they can play party politics with it. They're not really willing to avoid, to withdraw fully from using Russia in a partisan sense. But at the very least, no one is, you know, like not nostalgic, but no one is rosy-eyed, or I'm literally forgetting my metaphor here. No one is glossing over the difficulties of Russia, let's say. So I think that there are problems with their troop movements along Baltic borders and the Ukraine border. I think that's always a concern. But at the same time, I think that it's important to remember that if Putin was to launch another war, and if he was to do it really with Ukraine, and I don't mean like skirmishes in Crimea, but I mean some like other parts of Ukraine, Ukraine is not going to roll over. So that is a real war that is going to go on for a very long time. And Putin doesn't really have the capacity to fight that war, and may not have the political capital to spend on that war. All the other wars or like small scale invasions that he's tried are with countries that couldn't or wouldn't really fight back, or they weren't of an entire country. So the cost of fighting back was too high for whoever was being invaded. He could claim his victory. He could use that for his political ends. But Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, they are not that. They will fight till the last person is dead. And that is not a situation that Putin can afford to be in, I don't think. So I don't think at the end of the day, he is going to actually use those troop movements to invade. But the point is to make life difficult, is to distract us from something else. I don't know what that something else is, but you always have to think what, you know, I don't believe Trump played this four-dimensional chess, but I do believe the Russians are capable of doing that a lot of the time. So, you know, it's always look beyond the surface is the golden rule of whatever you're seeing with Putin. And I think I've run so far off the top of the question now. If you remind me of the actual question, I can go back.
Well, I mean, you're addressing, yeah, just how you think Biden is really going to respond to all of these.
Yeah, I think the next move they're going to make is on this pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think they are going to appoint a special envoy to try and deal with that. The problem is the pipeline is 98% built. And I think it is an example of Germany being too cute and thinking, as they often do, well, we're big enough, we can handle President Xi, we can handle President Putin. And the truth is the EU collectively can barely handle either of those parties. And every time they don't try and do it collectively, or they don't try and do it with the US, they end up biting off more than they can chew, or it doesn't go where it needs to go, like with the Iran nuclear deal. And that's not me saying the deal is the wrong thing to do, but like it's barely surviving. Like clearly Iran is worse than ever because the EU cannot pin that down on its own. And yes, the US needs to take some responsibility. It might be different if Trump had never left the deal, but the point is to demonstrate that the EU together struggles to really be in charge of these situations. And Germany on its own certainly can't be. And basically, they just think they can get some cheap gas and cut out the rest of the EU. And the rest of the EU is not very happy about that at all, but they're also not strong enough to take Germany down. And so those fights were playing out for 3 years, and Trump really just didn't want to touch it. And I don't know whether that is because of inappropriate connections or sympathies with Putin. I don't have the answer to that question, but the point is he was off the playing field when something could have been fixed. Now they are literally just screwing the last nuts and bolts on the thing. And so unless they're planning to invade Germany, I don't know how the US is going to stop this pipeline from working. Or the US has to come up with a much better offer. If it wants to ship a bunch of cheaper natural gas over on tanks to Germany, well, Germany doesn't need to turn that pipeline on then. But the Biden administration has to be very realistic about what it thinks is going to move the needle in this situation. So if it wanted to really come to the table with some very expensive but attractive offer, maybe they could get something of what they want in this situation. Otherwise, this envoy is for show, and it's about showing Republicans in Congress that he cares and that he's not sort of soft on this issue, but it's not actually going to change the situation.
That's great analysis. I was in Qatar a couple of years ago, and they were talking, they've never missed a shipping deadline for their natural gas, and that they feel like they could do it, and they're expanding that field. I asked someone from the embassy, and you know, you really get the runaround. So there are options, but yes. But
oh,
yeah.
one point on Russia. Sorry, this is slightly separate from what we just spoke about, but it does connect back into Russia's vaccine diplomacy and how it attempts to project into the world. There is new data that suggests that there's 300,000 excess deaths that haven't been included in COVID tolls in 2020 in Russia. So officially around about 120,000 died, which is getting close to the US death rate. Like, it's not quite as bad as the US, but it's certainly one of the worst in the world. And it looks like it could actually be 3 times as bad as what they have officially recognized. In which case, that is a disaster. But what it also demonstrates is that Putin is not using the vaccine to save his own people or solve his own problems. It's used for political gain globally. And it is a very good vaccine. Like, it actually has much stronger clinical results than I think all of the Chinese vaccines that are out there in the marketplace. Effectively, you know, essentially the same level as Moderna and Pfizer, as far as we can tell, although they weren't super transparent at the beginning about it, but it seems to be one of the better vaccines now. And he has big problems getting people taking it at home because they don't trust the government. So they might turn out to vote because there's no alternative, or they're worried what will happen if they don't vote. But they're certainly not going to get something injected into their arms that they don't trust, even though it is actually a good vaccine. So he has a lot spare to give away because he cannot administer it at home. And he's also tricked some people into believing the problem is less than it really is because of all the false statistics. So it is a big COVID mess in Russia. And I really think that has been underplayed in a lot of media. And, you know, I understand why no one wants to think in depth about such a depressing subject, but it probably could do with some more coverage, in my opinion.
Let me combine a question I want to ask with one that's here in the chat from Thomas Day about the Navalny situation. One thing that I hear some analysts say is the Russian buildup on Ukraine, some of the other stuff, says, how much are we talking about Navalny right now? It's kind of taken him right out of the news, you know, in our area.
And also, there we go. That answered the question I posed, and I myself forgot about Navalny because I've been switched off from my email for a week, and you kind of like, there is so much going on. He's on his hunger strike in Siberia. They're clearly not giving him the treatment he needs for the poisoning that he was subjected to several months back. And I think, yes, like part of that is about preventing him from becoming the martyr. You know, he could somehow turn himself into the nice version of Aung San Suu Kyi. Remember when she was everybody's human rights icon? Navalny was on the way to creating something like that, and it's true, we're not talking about it now. And I think that is definitely one of the tactics that Putin is trying to deploy. And I don't think necessarily that Navalny could somehow win a presidential election against Putin, but he can mess things up. United Russia nearly did fail to achieve a majority a few years back in one of the national elections. And that's the sort of thing that you could see turn around. You know, like, Putin's there until he's dead, basically. But, you know, they can have other problems. And Navalny was looking pretty adept at being able to present those problems to Putin. And then I think this is another one of the struggles that we have to think through very carefully in the West, in that Navalny has said and done some unpleasant things, but really, is anyone going to lead a political party in Russia who hasn't said or done some unpleasant things? I think we need to be realistic about that. And it doesn't mean that we endorse everything that he says or does, but if our goal is to create more stability in the world by not having Putin lead Russia, but we can't go in there and sort of shoot the place up, you know, you have to be realistic about who else could do that bidding. And Navalny is pretty much the only game in town at this point. And I think, you know, our choice is about how close do we want to be involved in that, or what forms of tacit or explicit support we might want to give. But there isn't another person to give the support to. Like, there's not a better version out there that we're just forgetting about. You know, we have to work with what Russian people are themselves willing to work with.
That's a really an excellent point there. I'm going to be running out of time here because I want to make sure the audience gets a chance to ask all the questions that they want. So I'm going to probably leave Iran and North Korea, Venezuela, those type of countries to our audience. If they don't ask questions, we have time at the end, I may feed back to some of that. But I got two countries I want to ask about, but one is that'll probably be your longest answer is China and Taiwan. With everything that's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it is. We could have a whole session just on China, I would say. I am actually quite worried. Like, I have done quite a few interviews where the other reporter tries to trick you into saying, yes, they're going to invade Taiwan tomorrow, sort of thing. Like, I'm not saying that is going to happen, but it is very clear that China has very deep plans. It is building up all across its near oceans and near seas. Like, there's no chink in that armor. Everywhere they can build out an artificial island, everywhere they can increase ship movements or inappropriately fly planes over someone else's airspace. Like, there's no example in that pattern where the error is sort of not in China's column. Like, it is clearly China that pushes the boundaries and the limits on everything there. Hong Kong is clearly the testing ground for how far they can push it on other things like Taiwan. And yes, the point to take away there is they largely abided by their commitments for 20 to 25 years on Hong Kong. So maybe the problem for Taiwan is only going to be 5, 10, or 20 years down the line. But clearly they are not going to be satisfied with the status quo with Taiwan. And so Taiwan has reason to be concerned. They are very isolated internationally because of China's economic leverage. And, you know, I think there are more countries who are starting to speak out and sort of at least take meetings with Taiwan and show that they're not going to be pushovers. But, you know, is the US really going to scramble everything in Guam and go all guns blazing to stop China? I don't know. Like, we didn't do it with Ukraine. You know, Taiwan is not any closer or further away than Ukraine was from mainland USA. So, you know, I have questions about what the world could do to stop China, but I think that there are strong moral arguments that we have to do a lot more. Like, because if the domino of Taiwan falls, like, who becomes next? You know, it's a very, very difficult situation. And I think that there is no, I think people understand that in Washington. It's not clear to me what the strategy is for dealing with it, but I think effectively the China hawks are winning or have won most of the arguments about this, and people have, the wool is taken off their eyes. I'm from Australia. You know, you can't export wine into China right now. They will take the iron ore because they need the iron ore, but anything else that's a major export for Australia into China is subject to tariffs ranging from 25 to 200%. There are campaigns in the Chinese media essentially discouraging Chinese students from coming to Australia, and that's actually Australia's second biggest export industry, is all of these fee-paying students at universities and other types of colleges, like vocational colleges and community colleges. And that is literally worth tens of billions a year to the Australian economy. And Australia was the most popular destination for Chinese students, even above the US, because it's cheaper to study here. And there's basically a state-run media campaign to not send your children to Australian education institutions. That's across the board. And Australia set themselves up for that by making China far and away their biggest trading partner. And then the rug is pulled from underneath you. And Australia is extremely close to the US. It's in the G20. It's not a major global power, but it's not nothing. And that's how China treats Australia. So the US can expect better treatment because China would not dare poke the US in the way that it pokes Australia or Taiwan. But, you know, its intentions are clear. Like, they're not peacefully rising and just doing it in a corner anymore. So I think we have to be very aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, and a whole nother one we're not going to have time to get into is the TTP, which is now the CPTPP.
Yep.
You know, and where you think might go on that. Maybe we'll see if there's a question in the chat. All right, the final country is actually I have two countries that I specialize in, Turkey and Cuba. But Cuba is the one I'm going to ask you about. I've been there 5 times, know several people down there. Everybody thought, including my Cuban friends down there, thought this would be right on the front burner for Biden. And, you know, we see change back. It is not. It's just almost like it's not on the radar. Are you hearing anything? Any thoughts?
I'm not actually, and I have to admit, I'm in no way a Cuba expert. So I think you'll be giving me the update on rather than the other way around. What I would say is that the administration just has so much on its plate. Like, it is really tough. And I think that this is something that other governments and institutions have felt very strongly about as well, is they kind of don't want to be Joe Biden right now. It must be the hardest, obviously it's always the hardest job in the world, but to confront COVID, to confront all of the racial issues that have been going on, never mind the global challenges around climate and so on, there is just so much on his plate that most other governments and institutions are trying not to make life harder at this point. And I think that means there's a little bit, you know, there's a bit too much smiling going on and everyone pretending it's all great when actually some problems aren't really being solved, or we're sweeping some things under the rug that ought to not be sort of delayed. But most people are trying to give him a break right now. And I think in that grand scheme of things, Cuba is still a bit toxic politically. Like, we saw the problems the Democrats have had in Florida. They are extremely disorganized in general in Florida. They clearly don't know how to appeal to that changing population, and they had big problems with how Latino men responded to them. And so I think to dive right into Cuba, it's almost like a no-win situation. You know, it's kind of, it may be the right thing to do to build a more mature, deeper relationship. I'm sure some people would love to go on holiday there. But in the grand scheme of things, like, it's kind of like priority 100, I think. And so that's why you're not seeing a lot of movement.
I'll just let you know very quickly that the government was starting to feel some pressure to make some changes until Trump rolled a bunch of stuff back. And now they can blame the United States for everything again. In the chat, maybe on Turkey, somebody might want to ask questions about them. They are, I understand, I just read today, are going to leave troops in Afghanistan.
Yep.
And Erdogan, as we know, is a whole different player too that Biden's going to have to deal with in many different areas. So if you've not submitted questions in the chat yet, we please encourage you to do so. And I've got one from Edie Bernard for you. What's the advantage of being an island there in Australia?
Oh, yes. So the system that Australia has is very severe arrival caps. So it is literally possible to land a boat on Australia in one of its far-flung coasts. And that was, if not a common tactic, it was certainly something that happened regularly with Vietnamese refugees from the 1970s onwards. But it's a lot harder to get a little 2-bit boat across a big ocean and safely land it somewhere where there's going to be drinking water when you get there. Because let's imagine you land that boat in the middle of northwestern Australia. What are you going to drink when you get there? You know, you might be hundreds of miles from the nearest reasonable drinking water. Australia is a big country, but not a country with a lot of water, which is why it can't support anything like the population of the US. So Australia has always had a very strictly controlled border, to the point of extreme harshness when it comes to people trying to land without approval. And in the case of a pandemic, then that makes it relatively easy to shut down. And so now they allow only 6,000 people into the country each week for all reasons, of all nationalities, including returning Australians. So there's still 36,000 Australians who would like to come back to Australia, who cannot get into Australia at the moment, because with those flight caps, effectively, you can only buy a first-class ticket or a business-class ticket to get into Australia. And so a one-way flight from the US to Australia right now is $14,000. And so I couldn't do that way. I had to hack it with my own special route via Detroit and Seoul and then Singapore, and then swap to a business-class ticket for that final leg. It took me 68 hours of flying and transiting. And I was able to get in as an Australian, and it cost me about $5,500 US one way. And I did that for my mother because it's a very extreme situation for her. But there's certainly no scenario where you could just go on a vacation to Australia right now. Like they literally would not let you in. I don't think you could even buy the ticket. And then when you get to Australia, the military drove the 30 of us that were on the flight, because it's a maximum of 30 per flight. And we were driven with a military escort to a hotel and then locked in our rooms for 2 weeks. And no windows, no balcony, nothing. They dropped food in a paper bag 3 times a day at the door. No exercise, nothing for 2 weeks. You pay $3,000 for that. And then you take further tests when you're out on day 16. And and then, I left the US 4 weeks ago, and I'm on my sixth day of freedom right now. So wow. It's like torturous. But what it means isn't there's no COVID. So, I watched 3 days of TV news, and one case of a person in hotel quarantine, they showed up as positive after the quarantine ended. And that in turn led about 17 other people to contract the virus, and they traced each of those individual people. The whole city of Brisbane, 2.5 million, went into lockdown for 5 days in order to track down exactly where the virus had gone. And, power to them in one respect, but also just felt so over the top. Like it really, it's kind of an Orwell type state when that is happening, but no one's died. So, the state of Queensland where that happened, I've had 6 deaths, just that number of fingers and thumbs in the entire pandemic. And they have 5 million people living there.
Wow.
That's why it's an advantage to be an island when it comes to COVID.
Yeah.
But also Australians aren't allowed to leave. So as an Australian, you cannot board a plane. I can do it because I have a working visa for the US, but I can't, my friends can't decide, oh, I'm moving overseas because I'm sick of Australia. You're not allowed to. Wow. And I think that raises big human rights questions around what is citizenship? Yeah. If it doesn't let you enter a country, and if your passport doesn't let you leave a country.
Yeah, it is a tricky balance. Angela Weck has a question that actually ties what I was immediately going to ask you. She's talking about climate change, environmental issues seem to have fallen by the wayside, yet the challenges for the world's commons continue to grow. Where have we seen progress in addressing climate change? How do we keep the world's fingers on this pulse? And I was going to point out, I've been to the Great Barrier Reef. I've been in the Blue Mountains, which are pretty much burnt down with the huge fires that are going on. If anybody understands climate change, Australia certainly does. So maybe both her question about where we're seeing progress, but particularly where Australia is in working with other countries.
Yeah, I'm a little bit embarrassed as an Australian on climate change, to be honest. I think people have no doubt that the climate is changing, but they doubt their ability to influence it as 1 to 2% of the global economy and population. So their attitude is, until China and the US make serious commitments together, there's literally no point in Australia making serious commitments, which is also extremely economically convenient for Australia, because then they can sort of live with themselves exporting all of the dirty coal and other mining that occurs to fuel China's rise. And I think, I think we're at the point now where we know that humans are causing a lot of this, maybe not all of it. And I think that there has been genuine progress among those big powers over the past 12 months. The US clearly is going to announce a 2030 target, which is really important. We're at the point now where essentially everyone is being the good guy when it comes to the 2050 targets and getting to the net zero emissions. But most politicians won't be in office. The ones serving today will not be in office in 2050. That's the easy commitment to make, in a sense. The hard commitment is, who are you going to tell won't have a job in 5 years' time because you have a really tough 2030 target? And I do think that it needs to happen, but there are going to be very big bumps along the way. And so this year is the crunch year in that respect. John Kerry is making waves and getting a lot of attention as he goes around the world, trying to gin up that level of enthusiasm and getting everyone on the same page. But that's really only going to work once the US can get a proper 2030 target passed through Congress. And that's going to be very hard. And the rest of the world isn't going to take the US seriously until that happens. They will appreciate John Kerry. They recognize that it's a different administration with a very different tune, and they're grateful for it. There really is not a lot of pushback around the world. Maybe even Brazil does not want to ruin the environment. They just want to be paid to save it. And there's a dispute about, will we pay them to do that or not, or should they do it on their own steam? But essentially everyone's, like really overwhelming gratitude that John Kerry has that position and is trying to solve it. But people are skeptical that anything can happen until that target goes in. And it's only when that happens and Australia is truly the pariah that Australia might jump on board there. Like the Blue Mountains, they'll burn down and an Australian will tell you, yep, but it'll be back in 2 years. It regenerates very quickly. I don't agree with that position, but that's a very common response that you will get from an Australian. And I think China has a big self-interest here. So I do think that it's changing and going to keep changing. But that doesn't mean they aren't going to do a lot of damage along the way. So the world shut down a lot of coal capacity over the past 12 months. China turned on more than the world shut down. So we went up in 2020. So first time in 5 years, coal output grew. And that's a problem. And there is some fairly new statistics out in the US which show that, yes, there are good paying jobs in solar, for example, in renewable energy. These jobs are real, they do exist, but in a lot of cases in the US, they pay $14 an hour less than the fossil fuel industry jobs. So when we talk about, that famous idea of like, can a coal miner go and install solar panels? Well, yes, that literally can happen, but that person would be earning $14 an hour less. And until there can be a serious answer to that question, or a serious other form of retraining scheme, the exact same complaints that you hear will continue to be heard in the US. But on the bright side, a lot of the areas that are most suitable for wind energy, for solar, they're fairly Republican areas. So the winners in job terms from growth of renewable energy in the US, it's going to be mostly Republican held areas. So I'm yet to see like a proper case being made about, I would love, maybe not Jill Biden, although I think she's fairly effective, but could be the president himself. Somebody should be out there making that tour, and whether it's on Amtrak or I don't know how they're going to get themselves about, but somebody in that administration should be going to those 50 reddest counties that have the most wind and start talking about all the jobs that are going to arrive from this infrastructure plan. And if they don't do that, that's when the plan is going to be in trouble. And then that's when you don't get the result you want, Angela, on the climate issues.
All right, great information. Michelle Eaton has a question that I have in my mind as well. Looking from the outside, how has America's image, and you've kind of addressed this before, as a democracy changed after January 6th? Is it viewed as something specifically tied to Trump, who's no longer in power, or has it demonstrated how fragile even our democracy really is?
I think it is both, to be honest. And I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier, actually, because in my head, it was like so linked to COVID. And I know they're two distinct issues, but the takeaway that people in other countries are having is when they see COVID or they see the Capitol insurrection, what they see is the system falling apart and kind of, like jaws on the floor sort of situation. So I think that people still believe in the capacity of Americans to reinvent themselves and to pick themselves up. I don't think that's in doubt. But, there's a much greater degree of skepticism in general. People sort of took American democracy or American leadership for granted for a very long time, in the sense that they assumed it would always be there. It would always work out, even if there was a bump in the road. Now I think people want to see the evidence a lot more. They're a bit like, okay, we want to believe in America, or we like this new president, but we'll believe it when we see it. We're not going to believe it because the president stood in front of a presidential seal in the Oval Office and said it. They want to see the results, let's say. And I think that's a different ball game for America. And it gets back to that point about the alliances, where I think, the alliances were something that helped America and kind of, helped America project power, but they weren't really essential for the US. If the US had wanted to run roughshod over people for most of the last 75 years, it could have chosen to do that and mostly would have gotten away with it. I think it's a different ballgame now. I think the alliances are essential, and often the US can't achieve what it wants to achieve without having the allies on board or without splitting the resources, or else you would have to be investing a lot more in military, or be willing to be a less wealthy country if you wanted to shut off a lot of other connections. There's ways to do it, but I just think the alliances have become so much more critical now. And the unfortunate aspect of the last 4 years is that that was something that was true independent of who won the election in 2016. But the person who won just didn't believe in those alliances and had a different approach. And so it's almost like right at that proving point of that reality, Americans weren't being exposed to it because everything was always about Trump the whole time. And I think the truth of the central nature of those alliances is just going to keep revealing itself over the next few years. And I don't know exactly how the American population will take to it, but I think it will become a much sort of more integral part of the political discussion. And I noticed that something like COVID makes people question. They're like, well, why do these other countries do it so much better than we do? What could we do better about our own systems? America's reference points are growing. Instead of just assuming America has the best of everything and Americans can solve it all themselves, people are starting to be like, oh, hang on, maybe these other countries have a solution. Maybe we can swap the solutions. It's just more of a expanded thought process, which I think is very much in line with what your organization's about. It's kind of like your vision is becoming reality, I think is what I would say. Happens very slowly, but I think it's what's happening.
Right. Angela also pointed out, I think, in reference to your ability to get in and out of Australia, except for tennis competitors.
Oh, yes.
It seems like athletes.
For VIPs,
in general,
there is
yes,
always a special solution. I think
good.
What happened there.
She also has.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, they had to go through the exact same hotel quarantine. There was no exception in that regard.
Okay.
But I think what they did allow some special charter planes to arrive. So for that week of arrivals for all the tennis players, it wasn't the usual 6,000 cap. But we saw during the tournament the way all the crowds were sent home at one point because Melbourne entered a special 5-day lockdown because they had found a couple of COVID cases that got out of the hotel quarantine. So yeah, it was slightly easier for those VIPs, but they still got 90% of the treatment that I went through.
All right. I've got one more I'm going to ask from the chat, and then I do want to finish with a question about Iran. Mm-hmm. But Angela really has a good one to kind of put a little cap on everything that you and I have talked about tonight, or in the morning for you. She talks about, what do you think should be Biden's top 3 priorities? Mm-hmm. There are so many, but if you had to select 3, which 3 does the world think the U.S. should focus on? And I think you addressed earlier, he's got so much on his plate now. He can't do it all. So where would you put advice?
I would have jobs at the center of any of the 3. I think he's in a sense doing that as well. So it's almost like I'm just agreeing in a way. So I've tried very hard to be neutral. I don't want to look like I'm endorsing anyone. But I think it must be made clear to Americans that there are decent jobs in their future if they're willing to work towards them. So like the education must be accessible. Like I'm not in any way suggesting people just get given jobs for free or they don't have to work for it, or that there isn't problems in getting to it. But I think he must work to rebuild those more solid middle-class jobs. And that doesn't mean a job for life. I'm not saying the job is exactly like it was 20 years ago or that it would be in a factory, but he really has to be investing in skills, finding ways that there are clear numbers of jobs being delivered via the infrastructure spending and that it's not just going into a pit. And I will put that across any of the issues. I think that leads very neatly into sort of green transitioning. So I would say green transition. That's maybe not a sexy way to describe it, but that blends the climate and the infrastructure problems with the job issue. So I think that definitely has to be very big for him. China, clearly, it's just impossible to escape. And so that would range from perhaps there should be a Western alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, China's big infrastructure plan. So if Biden can make his domestic infrastructure plan work, what can he do with Britain and Canada and the EU and Australia to offer a genuine alternative of infrastructure investment to other countries? You know, and I don't mean that in the sense of aid, because I think there's lots of problems with lots of the ways that aid has been sort of conceived of and delivered over the decades, and it's not very popular, even if it's useful. It's not popular to give aid. And also it's just terrible to do what China is doing, which is essentially trap all of these developing countries in debt traps. That is completely inappropriate and not useful for anybody. So there must be a middle way. And is that part of the China policy? Like, that would be my question for Biden. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it. So I'd definitely make them my top two. And then I think my third would have to be dealing with the racial divisions in the US. You know, I'm still learning on that front too, but I think if a problem took 400 years to build up, it's not going to get solved in 100 days. It's not even going to get solved in 4 years. And I think that, you know, a lot of us haven't fully understood that. And I think it's going to take a whole of government effort to try and deal with it. And there are going to be mistakes along the way. But I think that there is a lot of pain and a lot of problem. And, you know, and that all comes with its own economic price tag as well in lots of different ways. So in order to recapture that idealism globally and do the morally right thing at home, I think that has to be addressed domestically. And people will see that. You know, people from outside of the US follow an American presidential election almost as closely as Americans do in some ways. And because they're not bombarded with the horrible television ads, in some ways they probably follow it closer because they're not sick of it as soon as Americans are sick of it. They can just take the pure news dose and ignore all of the leaflets and the television ads. So I think they're very aware of those domestic issues and will adjust their view of America accordingly.
All right. I don't want to run over the allotted time. I definitely want to get Iran, but Thomas Day also asked a question that I'm dying. So if we run over 2 or 3 minutes, but I've given you head warning on the length of your answer. All right. But I definitely want to know your thoughts of where you think the Biden administration is going to go with Iran.
Yeah, I think that they are not sold on going back into the deal. I think a lot of people assume that they're just going to do it, and I don't think they're sold on it. So, you know, probably on balance, I would bet that they will keep pushing, and they want, I think on balance, they would rather be in the deal than not in the deal. Like, I think we know that from the campaign rhetoric, but I think that they're also clear that it's a bit radioactive politically. Like, it's not necessarily clear that you solve any of these problems by going back into the deal, but you do hang it politically around your neck for Republicans to attack you on throughout all of the next election cycles. So there are big risks with doing it. And the Iranians have been playing pretty loose with the deal. You know, they think they deserve something extra in order to stick with what they've already promised to do. And the US wants something from them. So that doesn't add up. You know, if Iran wants to be given something and the US thinks they actually, in fact, are owed more, you know, that is not all the parties coming together at the table. So I suspect it's going to be a lot bumpier than a lot of people assume. They kind of, I think there are some people who have it in their heads that somehow Biden is friends with the mullahs and they're all just going to have a meeting and it can be done. No, I think we're still going to be talking about this in a couple of months' time. And it's far from clear that it will all work out.
Thomas's question, the gist of it gets to something I've been wondering about, is that is there a perception that Biden is appointing qualified and capable individuals to lead the institutions? And you know, we did obviously had situations. Ronell, the ambassador to Germany, seemed to be more there to antagonize rather than, you know, work. We've had that where several of Trump's nominees were more to create problems than they were harmony. So is the word on the street Do they think Biden is appointing people they can work with and trust, or not?
Yes, but I think that some people they have sort of rose-tinted glasses about Democratic administrations, like in the same way that Obama was built up. You know, I think a lot of other governments would prefer a Democratic administration because they are more interested in the alliances that the other countries need or hope for. And then they find that the reality of negotiating with an American administration is never really that pleasant because, you know, essentially the Americans are the bigger party at the table. And in most negotiations, that doesn't work out so well for the little party. So I think there's always a bit of a sort of a gap that needs closing between the perception and the reality there. But yes, by and large, I think that they've been well received, especially on trade. Catherine Tai is, you know, she's held in high regard and people think she's serious. They like Blinken as well. They think he's committed. And they know what they're dealing with in Blinken because he's been around for so long at the State Department. They obviously knew John Kerry from his time at the State Department. So I think that there's a decent mix of familiar faces and experienced hands. I don't think there's a lot of questioning of that, let's say. But I think as well on the ambassador front, like they have been quite slow to announce the names of potential ambassadors. And I think that indicates a fundamental tension between going for the career diplomats. And I think they will have certainly more career diplomats than the Trump people had. But at the same time, you can't escape that there's a whole donor class now. And some of those people want and expect, you know, it's never sort of described as an explicit payoff, but you know, they are qualified people. They did put a lot of money down on the table. And, you know, when the system is that 25% of the jobs go to those people, you know, they can all count. They're like, where are the 40 posts? Which one am I getting? And those are a lot of the behind the scenes phone calls that are going on. But one thing I would say is that while previous administrations have made announcements sooner than the Bidens about some of the top appointments, you know, some of the Trump appointments took 18 months to fill. So Biden is not unreasonably slow in that context. You know, I think what you might see is when he's ready to go with the names, it might come in 1 or 2 or 3 batches and we all just get sent a PDF and here's the 200 names, bam. Maybe not 200, but maybe sort of like 50 at a time, instead of this dribbling out of individual names that you saw with the Trump people, where it was just, you know, it was never as organized as the Biden people have been. So yes, I expect probably sometime, I'm going to guess early May, and we're going to get a big dump of ambassador names, and most of them will be career diplomats. That's my bet.
And we'll see how the donations work out. Sometime I would love to privately talk with you about your thoughts too on one of our great career diplomats, William Burns, being the head of the CIA and the impact you think that might have. So I'm going to be in DC in September, November, and I might try to see if I can buy you lunch and you can fill me in on that.
I'll buy the beer.
Hey, I cannot thank you enough. I am a fan of your reporting tonight. You've given us, at least me anyway, an awful lot to think about. You brought up some great new points as well. We definitely want to wish your mother all the best. Glad to hear that things are moving along. And after your journey getting there, everything you went through, your kindness and still giving us of your time. And I found it very enlightening. So thank you so much. Before I turn it to Angela, one quick point. I want to give a big shout out and thanks to my oldest daughter, Jessica Samford. My computer completely died. There is no spark of life to be found. All I heard from the computer repairman was, this is probably going to cost you a lot of money. And my daughter, that's why the background looks different for the old timers on here as well. And she bailed me out tonight, so I can't leave without thanking her for that as well. So again, thanks, Ryan, and I'll let Angela close us out.
Thank you very much, Ryan Heath. This has been a very invigorating, a very broad discussion of a lot of topics. Thanks for dancing around the entire world with us. On behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, Bradley University, and all our friends in the World Affairs Council system, thank you very much. If you are not a member of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, I invite you to join us. You can find all of our upcoming events at PAWAC.org.